Microbix is a fast-growing and profitable developer and producer of diverse proprietary biological products for the healthcare market. We've got CEO Cameron Groome, who I've known for many years as he's grown this business. Last year was a strong breakout year for the company, and Cameron is here to tell us why 2025 is looking strong with its robust pipeline and opportunities to continue driving growth. I'm Martin Gago with Market Radius Research. It's Tuesday, January the 14th. Please remember, this is neither recommendation nor investment advice. Cameron, it's really great to have you here. It's been a while since we've reviewed your business. I'm looking forward to the refresh and figuring out what's in store for 25.
Thanks so much, Martin. I really appreciate your inviting me and to represent Microbix and for everybody to have taken the time to join us. I'll treat this as a bit of an introduction to Microbix for
Please.
people that don't know the company, and I'm sure there's a few people on the call that do, and we'll get into some updates for them as well. Our business is involved in two areas, both of healthcare, both diagnostics and therapeutics, and so medical tests and the drug side of things as well. And in the diagnostics side, we have a profitable and very rapidly growing business at the forefront of a lot of global innovations happening in the sector, and I'll hopefully be able to communicate some of the excitement and the opportunities that we're having in that. So that's a very exciting area of our business, and we're doing already doing over 20 million a year run rate in that side of our business in revenues. And then on the therapeutics side, we've got an incredibly unique opportunity whereby we own the rights to an FDA-approved drug. So the drug that we're developing is already approved by FDA, and we're validating new manufacturing to bring that back to market. And that's an asset that's already been partnered. So we have a fully funded program to bring that back to market. So when we talk about Microbix, we're making money. And in fact, we're buying back and canceling shares rather than issuing them or having to run around and raise capital. So it puts us in a very strong position to continue building value for shareholders. And, persons that have done the analysis look and say, gosh, either one of those elements of the business is worth more than the market cap of the company today. And as we continue to drive forward and unlock value, I think we'll see a real appreciation of our shares. I'll just see if I can advance slides here a little bit. There we go. Forward-looking statements, brevity is the soul of wit, so we'll keep it brief on that and jump forward. So our market capitalization, we're listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, so the big board, and on the OTCQX in the US, which is one level down from NASDAQ. So we have the liquidity in the US, but without the major costs of full NASDAQ listing and compliance. We've been trading a decent amount. That's been moving up in terms of the daily trading volume, particularly after we announced some very strong results for our fourth quarter, for September 30th fiscal year. And we capped off a very strong 2024 fiscal year with over 25 million in revenues and 3.5 million in net earnings. So good daily volume. We have a very good liquidity position. We closed September 30th with 13 million in cash on the balance sheet and an undrawn line of credit for another couple of million, so 15 million in total availability. Very strong ratios as well. We do have analyst coverage on the company. David Martin, the senior analyst at Bloom Burton, the Canadian healthcare specialized investment bank, provides research coverage, and they have I believe a 90-cent target price right now. And Bruce Krugel, that is respected former equity research department director, it provides company commissioned research on Microbix, but his conclusions are his own. And he just issued an update in our fourth quarter with a 12-month target price of $1. So some very good liquidity for shareholders, and we continue to work to generate that, and in fact, bring the share count down, not up at this stage. My own background, I'm they say it's not the years, it's the mileage, but I've got a lot of mileage on me in both capital markets, where I spent about half of my career as a equity research analyst and investment banker. So understanding public company milieu and how to run them to create shareholder value, and about half of it in life sciences operations. And most importantly, I'm joined by a really great team of people. We've just got a ridiculously deep bench of talent and smart, talented, dedicated people that make it all happen. So, God forbid if I got hit by a bus, there's a great team making it happen. And, and I'm the cheerleader and the coach for that. So Jim Curry, CFO, Ken Hughes, COO, Phil Caselli, Mark Lucier, many other people on our team that you can look up. Similarly, we've got a fantastic and independent board. Martin Marino is our board chairman, has tremendous expertise with Apotex and Merck. Our audit committee chair, Von Ebro Pantaloni, experience in industry with Bayer, Novofarm, and other companies. Joe Renner, major shareholder as well, as an incredibly successful pharmaceutical executive. Jen Stewart, very powerful government relations and media relations professional. Peter Bletcher, medical doctor, providing some great medical insights. And Mark Cochran with U.S. health system experience, tremendous amount of work as an executive with Johns Hopkins and other major organizations. So serious people, and we run the company quite seriously as well. Where we are on a number of programs and projects is, I mentioned our work, and we do a tremendous amount in the field of diagnostics between our test ingredients and our medical devices. And then we have our fully funded therapeutics program. And I'll touch on details around these and substantiate some of the assertions I'm making as we go through the presentation. But here you can see, we have multiple products and we have multiple industry-leading customers as well. So companies like Copan, who's a strategic partner that makes the ubiquitous flocked swabs for collecting biological samples. You've all probably had one of these swabs up your nose during COVID times. The ones that didn't hurt and caused your nose to bleed and gave accurate test results were made by Copan, who's a partner of ours. Many other major companies as customers, world-leading diagnostics companies like Abbott, Becton Dickinson, Quidel Ortho. These are all our customers, and we can go right up and down the alphabet with such firms. And we started out making test ingredients, and I'll talk a little bit about what that comprises, and then moved on to the more sophisticated and more highly regulated environment of making medical devices, and are now by partners bringing value together in the therapeutic field, the drug field, and where diagnostics can cost millions in our segment of it to develop products and launch them. Drugs, of course, is far more expensive, costing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So for small cap companies, it's not practical to do that on your own. So we're doing that through partnerships, and we'll talk about those as well. So really where we are is at a really interesting nexus, and this slide really ties in a bit with our Microbix M shaped like a DNA logo. But our products in the diagnostics field, we're making some essential products that the major companies really require to get to the markets they're targeting. So if you look on the left side of the slide, there are different categories of our customers. These can be the agencies that actually check whether clinical labs know what they're doing and confirm that, are called external quality assessment or proficiency testing agencies. They're the test makers, the companies that actually manufacture tests, major multinationals or more niche players. And then there's the clinical laboratories, the Life Labs, Dynacares, Quests, LabCorp, et cetera, that are also customers of ours, and the many thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of smaller labs. And we're enabling them to get products to market, whether those are research diagnostics or laboratory developed tests, LDTs, whether those are fully FDA and Health Canada regulated tests, and even the point of care tests, the little toaster size instruments that can do clinical lab quality medicine at the patient bedside or the pharmacy, school, cruise ship, prison, mine site, film production set. We're right in the thick of that as well. So all of these opportunities that we're really opening up. And one of our key products in this area are what we call quality assessment products, or CAPs is the QAPs is the term we use as a nice catch-all that doesn't run afoul of any regulatory distinctions. And what these are mimics of patient samples, and these can be mimics of a patient sample that's positive for a disease condition. Could be a respiratory infection or a bladder infection. There's any number of these categories. So when you're getting a test, and a diagnostic test is really where medical care starts. You have symptoms, and then you can speculate what the cause of those symptoms are. But medical care really starts to be effective when you've got a definitive diagnosis where you say, okay, I know that this is flu, a viral infection in my lung rather than bacterial pneumonia, or I know this is a urinary tract infection with E. coli, or is that syphilis? These are whole, or do I have bladder cancer? These are whole gating items that control where you go in healthcare. And it's incredibly important that tests and medical professionals get this right. And many of us that aren't, many of our families and friends, et cetera, that aren't deep in the health system, you get a test, diagnostic test, and you say, well, I assume that's correct. But what if it weren't? What if it is a false negative test, and you say, gosh, I got a little tickle in my throat, but I don't want to go see a family member who's in the ICU if I might be coming down with a flu. And if you run that test and it's a false negative, you could be putting somebody at risk. Or imagine it hurts to pee, and you go into a doctor and you get a false positive for sexually transmitted infection, and explaining that to your partner. I have no idea what happened, how I got this. Marriages can end, embarrassment, or inappropriate treatment. Somebody gets diagnosed with a fungal infection for which there are very few therapeutics that might have profound side effects. And you've got a false positive. So both of these have real consequences. And what we do is we make these mimics of patient samples so that tests and the labs can actually be challenged to make sure that they work properly, and that there aren't errors in technician procedures, that there aren't problems with reagents or test cartridges, that instruments haven't gone out of calibration, or have some microfluidics port or electrode blocked that's causing it to fail. And these systemic failures are what we want to catch and make sure that that medicine is accurate. And in doing that, we provide products that help with the training and accreditation of labs to do testing. We provide these samples so that the labs can actually validate every day or every week at intervals to say, well, if I started with a known positive and a known negative at the start of the day, and then I run samples through the whole day, and I end with a known positive and known negative, well, if those 4 samples come up correctly, I can have greater confidence that everything I did through the day was working, versus if something unexpected or something doesn't work at the start of the day, I've got to tear down and figure out what's wrong with my procedures or equipment before I can start. And if something goes wrong at the end of the day, I know that all the samples I tested during the day are suspect, and they've either got to be retested or that patient has to come back in and give another sample. But no harm, no lasting harm was done. And we're also doing a ton of work in these new point of care instruments where testing is being done in non-traditional settings, where there isn't a PhD lab director with 20 years experience running a lab. Well, if you put an instrument into a nursing home or a school or a cruise ship, you don't have that quality system. So how do you make sure that nothing goes wrong there? Will our products become key in that world as well? And we'll talk about some of those examples. And we'll make our controls. Sometimes it'll be a little liquid vial like that. Sometimes it will come desiccated onto a sampling swab. Other times we might actually create a mimic of a actual tissue sample that's been fixed with formalin and paraffin that looks like a human tissue sample, but is again stable, non-infectious, and consistent. So we do all this sort of work to make sure that we're helping validate these tests, and that's why we have sales now in the tens of millions and north of 100 customers, because people need what we're providing. Martin, is there any clarification I should make there before we
I guess just very simply, you're testing the testing equipment to make sure it's running right.
Exactly. We're providing the materials to actually challenge those tests and make sure everything's working.
And it sounds like a real kind of razor blade kind of model where they're running these tests right on a very regular basis through the equipment. So it's not like once a year or just when you first get it set up, you're daily or weekly, you're running it, which is daily, weekly sales for you. Is that right?
That's quite right. And the frequency of use varies a little bit by category. So when the labs are getting their accreditations maintained, they have to subscribe to programs where they're tested at least 3 times a year for competency in every type of test they run. And we're providing a lot of those samples to the agencies that do that work. For the clinical labs, often they'll test, it might be once or more a day. Sometimes it can be once a week. Sometimes it could be once a month, depending on the automation level of the equipment and how prone it is to how many human interventions there are that can introduce more and more error, or how ticklish the processes are. And then for point of care diagnostics, the regulators say, hey, you don't have a quality system for this. If if the school nurse is running the test, you guys don't have a quality system. So every time you open a box of test cartridges, we want you to take a cartridge at random, take the Microbix control, and use one of the cartridges up to make sure you know what you're doing and nothing's gone bad. And that interval can be anywhere from 1 in 10 tests to 1 in 25 tests, depending on what the makers negotiated with the regulators. But again, all this is recurring sales, and that's what we're geared towards.
All right. No, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And some of our products, if there's anybody listening in that sort of has a molecular biology degree or something, they may be saying, well, that's got to be easy to do. You just slap in some DNA or RNA into your PCR test or a bit of protein. No, it's not easy, because what you're doing is these things have to be clinically relevant. They've got to be as close as they've got to the test. They've got to look, smell, feel, handle exactly like a patient sample. But the difference is our products are clinical, they're consistent, and we're always challenging the lower limited detection of the test to say not only is it working, but is it working, to the same specification it's supposed to. And we'll provide the whole genome of the organism if it's a PCR test, not just a little portion of its DNA. So our samples will work on all the tests out there in the marketplace. We provide the necessary formats of sample, depending on what the instruments or tests are geared to accepting. We've got room temperature stability. We can support these multiplex tests, like you've seen, everybody's seen tests evolve from, a few years ago, you said, oh gosh, I've got a COVID test. Now it's a test for COVID, flu A, flu B, RSV all at once. Well, when you're doing that, now you've got to have clinically relevant levels for each of those constituents of each of those channels of the test. We're doing a lot of work with resistance, antimicrobial or antibiotic resistant organisms to enable tests to not only look to say, hey, is it a bacterial infection and what bacterial infection is it, but taking it even a step beyond that and saying, well, what drugs will successfully treat it and what drugs are futile, so that you can quickly go in with the best possible medicine on that. And testing for variants, we just announced, in fact, on Monday morning, that we're working with an international lab accreditation agency to confirm that existing tests for flu will actually pick up the emerging H5N1 flu, so that it can be validated that those tests work. That God forbid if that breaks out, we're ready, and all the labs that have probably developed their own homebrew flu test, PCR test, that they'll actually pick up H5N1. Unless you check that, you oftentimes don't know. And then, of course, we're developing intellectual property, ours and other parties, to protect our innovations and ring fence where we can responsibly do so, our markets and our innovations. So I'll give a few examples for the ladies in the audience and most men that are involved with ladies. Cervical cancer's been a big thing for many, many years and can develop as a result of persistent infections with a virus that we've all been exposed to, and most of us probably still carry at a low level, human papillomavirus. And there's certain strains of this virus, or types, about 14 different types of it, that directly cause cervical cancer in women, can cause penile cancer, anal cancers, head and neck, throat, nasopharyngeal cancers. It's been very successful to reduce the incidence of that cancer by monitoring the cervical cells in ladies to see if there's been any cellular changes induced by that virus. But there has always been a much better way of doing it, which is to look for the virus itself that could cause cancer in 10, 15, 20 years. And that could be done using PCR methods. But there were no samples to validate those PCR tests, so the test couldn't get approved and the test wouldn't get reimbursed, and that innovation couldn't be rolled out. So Microbix has created these mimics of HPV-infected epithelial cells so that these tests could be validated for approval, rollout, and reimbursement. And that's opening many new markets for us. And now we're supporting the National Cervical Cancer Screening Program in the Netherlands using Becton Dickinson instrumentation. We're supporting the National Screening Program in Ireland using Roche Diagnostics instrumentation and tests. So, all this sort of work we're doing is enabling this better healthcare and revenue growth for us, and better healthcare for everyone.
And then I would imagine that this market, like testing, and then you have to test the test to ensure that they're accurate. That's just got to be a vastly growing market as technology improves, so that we know how to test these tests.
Absolutely.
And that, so
absolutely.
And then it seems like the testing world is able to identify and test a lot other different indications, diseases, viruses, everything else. So yeah.
Very much so. And it's really about, getting this dialed in. It's the same way, you wouldn't invest in a company if you said, well, oh gosh, they seem to have great results, so that they don't have an auditor. we're creating the materials to let you audit those results and ensure the accuracy and quality. And that's, huge element of everything we do is to make sure that our products are there to enable everyone to prove that those tests work.
All right.
And similarly, in the point of care areas, for example, one program we're supporting is called the Tango program in Australia: Test, Treat, and Go. And what they were finding there was that many patients in rural and remote communities and so forth, would complain of, for example, a urinary tract infection, and then it was difficult to follow up with those patients if they were getting a diagnosis weeks later. They might be back in a rural community, and then trying to organize treatment and follow up was just a nightmare for the health system there. Not too different from what we face in rural and remote communities in Canada. And so they said, what about putting in these point of care instruments in the community, and somebody can walk in, give a sample, and then they say, well, go get lunch or a coffee. And by the time you get back, we'll have a definitive diagnosis from you or for you. And we'll be able to tell you what pathogen or organism is causing the infection and what antibiotic will work best to treat it. And they found they had enormous success with that. But they had a problem in that for the quality control samples that they were using had to be kept at -80 and shipped around the Australian outback where it's, 30, 40 Celsius constantly. And it was completely impractical and impossible. And we said, hey, why are you doing that? We can provide you our control samples that are stable for 2-3 years at room temperature, or even at 30, 40 C. Let's go. And so we're supporting those global programs. We're supporting a company called Quidel Ortho on the rollout of a new PCR instrument that they've been developing that can test one sample for as many as 16 different pathogens from one sample. So, if you've got, for example, a child with a, bloody diarrhea, and you go, is this a potentially life-threatening emergency, or with an E. coli food poisoning, or is this a stomach virus, and take plenty of fluids and go home? Well, it's really nice if you can dial that in and find out right away within minutes rather than days, potentially, because the hospital lab's closed for the weekend. So it's this kind of work that we're supporting and enabling with many of these companies. So very proud to be able to do it, and it's a very profitable element for us, because we're taking a swab that costs us, 10 of cents, for example, and turning it into a molecular diagnostics control that we can sell for tens of dollars. So you can imagine, as our volumes increase, the profitability of that business is very good based on the level of sophistication, innovation, and value we're delivering. We're also moved into manufacture different reagents and sample collection devices. Thinking back to those COVID experiences, what did they do when they took the swab out of your nose? Well, they broke the stick and they put it in a tube of stuff. This stuff stabilizes that sample so it can be tested at least for up to 3 days later. Otherwise, the sample gets self-digested by the pathogens, the normal flora of your nasal tract, and the enzymes in the mucus. And within a few hours, the amount of virus left in the sample would have no relationship with what was there originally. And the whole testing process would be pointless. This solution and solutions like it stabilize that sample for days at a time, so that all of the virus that was originally there will be recovered. And we identified, for example, for Ontario, as the pandemic emerged, that they would have a tremendous problem getting reliable supplies of this product, and we pretty much kept the Ontario testing system from collapsing during COVID by providing this sort of product manufactured in Ontario by Microbix. And then, where we started our test ingredients business, in many instances, tests are not looking for a pathogen itself, but they're looking for the antibodies in your blood, those Y-shaped proteins, antibodies, that are an indicator as to whether you have immunity to a pathogen or have been exposed to it. And to detect those antibodies, you actually need the purified and killed organism to bind to that human antibody and drive that test reaction. And that's where our business started. And it's still somewhere over 50% of our revenues in that ingredients business. So we actually safely, and have been doing it for more than 3 decades at Microbix, growing, purifying, and inactivating a whole catalog of organisms that are enabling companies worldwide to make their tests. And we might sell, a gram of a virus, for example. That's a fifth of a teaspoon of concentrated inactivated virus, might sell for $500,000. So you can imagine when you're talking $500,000 for a fifth of a teaspoon, that's a pretty valuable product. Now you're not selling it on every street corner. There's a limited pool of buyers, but that's the level of expertise we have, and why we're selling all over the world, and why we've been able to build the company forward into the medical device field based on that legacy of expertise that we continue to build.
Cameron, so
Yeah,
your antigens business that you sell to the actual testing companies, and that's a sort of a key trigger that identifies the pathogen or whatever you call it that they're trying to do. But you don't sell the tests themselves. You sell one of the ingredients for that make their test possible. And then on the back end of it, you then test that test that your client has created.
exactly.
So you've kind of
And who
bookending
better? We're bookending it exactly. So we
okay.
don't compete. We don't compete with our customers.
Yeah,
We're actually assisting them on both ends of that. So assisting them
gotcha.
in making the tests, and then assisting the users to make sure those tests are working properly. Because again, these things can be have a lot of steps and materials that get used in the test. And if they're not used the right way, in the right order, at the right time, there's many things that can go wrong.
All right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And this has grown well for us as well. This used to be, the ingredient side used to be 90% of our business. Now it's around half of our business, not because it hasn't grown, but because we've been growing other areas more quickly. So I'll take a bit of a break from that before we get into financial results and give you an idea of value proposition. But let's talk about our biological drug. Years ago, Microbix identified that a leading therapeutic was actually manufactured with processes that we understood really well. So Microbix said, well, let's make a biosimilar or generic of that drug, and started down that pathway. And there were many plot twists along the way, but in a very series of improbabilities, we ended up owning the drug master file. We ended up owning the innovative drug, but we had nowhere to make it. So we had all the expertise to manufacture it, but guess what? Our facility is dedicated to growing viruses and bacteria. So no regulator in their right mind was ever going to let you make a human drug in a facility dedicated to growing viruses and bacteria and doing that work. It's just not on. And again, this is a business where you can spend tens and hundreds of millions. So it was trying to punch above our weight on that. So we ended up redirecting that, saying, how do we partner this? How do we find the right qualified partners that have the capital required to bring this back to market and realize this opportunity? So we ended up partnering this to a portfolio company of one of the largest and most sophisticated life science private equity firms in the world that came in, did extensive due diligence, and said, you know what? Everything Microbix has said here is true and accurate to the best of our assessment. We're going to step up and fund this. So they ended up providing $4 million US to Microbix as good faith money, as a licensing series of licensing payments, and received that. And now they're investing altogether on the order of 35 million Canadian to bring the product back to market and launch it back into the US initially, and then into other markets and other clinical indications. And initially, what this is for is actually dissolving blood clots in blocked biomedical catheters. So if you've got a dialysis lock in your arm, or a chemotherapy, or parental nutrition IV going into your central vein, those catheters can be indwelling for months at a time, and a little bit of blood backwashes into that causes a clot. You can't get therapy, and then somebody has to be anesthetized. There has to be a vascular surgeon come in and fish a whole new catheter, and then that's thousands of dollars, about $7,000 to $10,000 surgery, versus putting in $150 worth of a clot dissolving drug to get rid of, safely dissolve the clot, suck it out with the catheter, and get back on business. And our drug does this very effectively, and it's entering back into the US market, intended to do so, to change a monopoly for a drug called TPA by Roche Genentech into a duopoly, give better security of supply, a better product, and better pricing for the hospital markets. And we intend to capture about a third of the dollar value of that market for our product, and we'll receive a double-digit royalty on that, and a series of sales-driven milestones if we're successful in achieving the return to market and the market penetration. We have good reason to believe we'll succeed with both. So that is a late 2027 timeframe where that kicks in on top of the growth that we're seeing and the profitability that we're seeing from our diagnostics operations. So again, very strong position, and all this is detailed in our regulatory disclosures, news release history, and there's even a very good equity research piece on our website describing the whole product dynamics and market dynamics for our therapeutics program in some detail. So if anybody's
Cameron,
interested, yeah.
So will you be the you're not, it's your product, so you're not the contract manufacturer, but will you do the actual drug manufacturing, or are you developing the technology and then pass it off to a CMO organization or to Sequel for them to do it? And then
Great questions. We're providing right now the technical expertise, technical guidance to do it, and it's being set up at a contract drug manufacturing organization, or actually there'll be one for manufacturing the drug substance or the active ingredient, and then there'll be another contractor for actually doing the final product formulation and the filling and lyophilizing or freeze drying of the formulated product. So two main contractors for that are being paid for by our partner and supported by our technical expertise. You know, I would have loved to do the manufacturing, but that would have involved, raising a ton of money, diluting, our investors heavily, and it just didn't make sense at this juncture.
And then once the product is being sold, then you get like a royalty off of it, and you have limited sort of, maybe you oversee or answer questions from the manufacturing partner to work on troubleshooting, but essentially there's zero cost of goods. You just clip a royalty every time they sell?
Every time they sell, we'll clip a royalty. And we're also eligible for up to 30 million US in one-time milestones as different sales thresholds get achieved.
Yeah. And those, like the upfront and the milestones, those are to pay you for your intellectual property, but as well to fund your development because you're spending money to get it to where it is right now. Or
No,
is that on a cost
we're not
recovery? Are they
we're not
paying you to
spending.
like,
Yeah, they're actually reimbursing us
oh,
rates for our consulting activities, and they are paying all the bills by from the third parties for the actual redevelopment of manufacturing capabilities for the product. So it's all upside for us.
interesting. All right. And then obviously they're taking care of the marketing and I even though it's been FDA approved, I presume that FDA is going to poke their fingers in this and make sure it's manufactured properly and do some testing or whatever that is. But their
Absolutely.
sequel is covering that completely. And while it's nothing, especially in healthcare, is risk-free, it's relatively low risk that there are clear milestones and hurdles that need to be done. You're not going into pivotal trials or anything like that.
Absolutely. The safety and efficacy of the drug has been very well established. It's been it's treated an estimated 4 million patients when it was on when it was on the US market for a number of years. And we're looking to bring it back into that now. The FDA will scrutinize the manufacturing and say, is this to the latest standards? Are all the processes properly validated? Do you have comparability data, et cetera? But there's little to no clinical risk associated with the product if we do our jobs correctly.
All right. Thank you. That's interesting.
Yeah, so a lot of fun. I mean, to actually have a fully funded drug program with very little clinical risk and a well-defined market, you don't get that too often, and you certainly don't get it within a company that's already profitable.
Yeah. And sorry, just a refresher, did you say 2027 is the expected product market
That's
launch?
that's what we're targeting. Yeah.
Okay.
There's always moving part. There's certain things that could accelerate that timeline. There's, any number of things that could delay it, but
Yeah.
that's certainly what we're targeting.
Up until that point, you're expecting provide an estimated $50 million of prepayments you're expecting to come in through now
No, no,
and then?
no, our next payment will be on the reapproval by FDA, and
Yeah.
then we'll have milestones and royalties following that.
Okay.
But it's the partner investing in the program that will occur over the interval between now and then.
Oh, that's how much they're putting into it. Gotcha.
Correct.
And
Yeah,
then,
yeah.
okay. And have these milestones, have you been able to, your upcoming milestones, what the value of those are, or is that still a secret?
We've not broken it out precisely, but we have $1 million thank you on reapproval, and then we have 30 million US in one-time milestones as different sales thresholds are achieved going
Gotcha.
forward, and that's on top of the royalty stream.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, all
Yeah,
right. That's
so
exciting.
very good. Yeah, absolutely. Broadly speaking, I've said we're hoping that we'll receive, as this gains traction in the marketplace, somewhere between 15 and 25 million US in royalties per year, as the product gets full traction in the US and potentially some other markets like Canada and the European Union. And that's for the catheter clearance indication. There are other indications that the drug is well established for as well, such as treating systemic clots like pulmonary embolisms, peripheral arterial occlusions, deep vein thrombosis, heart attack, stroke. But those will be longer to bring it back to market for those indications. Requires clinical work and larger production capacity. So lots of moving parts. So generally speaking, we just keep people focused on the nugget of the catheter clearance, as it's the most straightforward and nearest term opportunity there.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. So what are we in terms of the company? I think it's useful to look at the reality of it. We've got about 130 staff currently. That'll be closing in on 150 staff members by the end of fiscal 2025. And we actually have 3 adjacent buildings that we occupy with about 35,000 square feet of space altogether. Our 3 buildings, we own one of them where we do our hot biology work, fully licensed by Health Canada, FDA, European Union compliant, Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration compliant. And then we have 2 leased buildings on either side of it where we do different elements of our manufacturing and validation work, and really developing state-of-the-art capabilities up and down the line. We've developed tremendous expertise in synthetic biology, which is a buzzword, but we're actually doing it, not just talking about it. And we've moved to state-of-the-art digital quality management systems and ERP systems as well. So we've developed the infrastructure that lets us scale our revenues without choking on the on management of the business and control systems. So very good capacity. We're not using anywhere near our full capacity for revenue generation currently. The one thing we'll run out of space for is desking. But for manufacturing, we're in very good shape.
Roughly, are you
Yep.
able, like you're at 50% capacity utilization, 70%, or obviously different products, like scenarios would change things, but you say you're in good shape. What would that broadly mean?
For our test ingredients business, for our antigens, I'd say we could double our production within the current envelope. As we continue, as different product volumes increase, we can reinvest to make the processes more efficient and reduce the footprint required. We've done that successfully. And for our controls business, we've got very good capacity for both our liquid format controls and our swab format controls. So we're at under 20% of capacity for those two product lines right now. So we've got a lot of potential room to grow there. And we also have automation plans as that justifies itself too. For example, during pre-COVID, the team thought it was tough to do 100,000 vials a year of filling. And then as we got into the reagent side during COVID, we peaked out for those products at 200,000 units a week, as opposed to 100,000 a year. So we're pretty good at scaling. It's about time, intelligence, and capital to put it to work.
All right.
Yeah, so all this very real, and we're about depending on traffic, 15 to 20 minutes from Pearson Airport. So if anybody on the call does want to visit and tour their facilities, we're more than welcome if we can schedule it to arrange that for investors. And we periodically do run some group tours with our IR representative, Adelaide Capital, as well. We've done that on a few occasions also. One of the really fun things when you're involved in the diagnostics business, it's not the same elements sometimes of watching paint dry when you're developing a therapeutic asset, where it can be, so many years to recruit patients into a clinical trial and then open the envelope. We're just going at incredible pace in creating value, across our different business lines. So you can see this is just the projects we have completed over the 12 months from December of 23 to December of 2024. So, we've hit different thresholds, like, first time we got $1 million batch of orders from one of our customers in the test controls business was a nice little milestone to celebrate. Developing novel test controls in ulcer disease, head and neck cancer, sexually transmitted infections, point of care for hepatitis C testing, herpes simplex virus testing, human papillomavirus work, even genetics testing. We've gotten involved now in oncology, and our first test controlled in genetics. There's a class of antibiotics called the aminoglycosides, where they're very, very effective for treating bloodstream infections, but a segment of people will go profoundly and irreversibly deaf if they get those antibiotics. Even one dosing will have that effect if you've got a certain genetic profile. And it was up to very recently a lottery, as you know, well, you're at risk of dying from a bloodstream infection. We could use the second best antibiotic, or you've got a 1 in several hundred risk of going deaf. What do you want us to do? Boy, that's a Sophie's choice. That's a tough one. Now there's the choice. We can run a test that'll cost about $20, and it'll tell you in 15 minutes, would you like to spend the $20? Boy, line me up for that one. So we're supporting the accuracy of that kind of testing and encouraging it to be used rather than placing adults or children at that kind of risk. So this is the kind of work we're supporting and doing, up and down the line. But you get the idea of the pace of the innovation we're leading. All these seeds that we sow in new projects ultimately grow and become bigger and recurring revenue streams as we move forward. So we're doing a lot of seeding of these opportunities, and that's what's starting to drive an accelerated growth. And you could see a little bit the past several years, we were reorienting the business to take advantage of some of these innovations and opportunities in 2019 when COVID broke out. And that hit our sales in 2020 because patients weren't seeing doctors and doctors weren't seeing patients. And so we reoriented to support some of the pandemic response work and had good growth in 2021 and 2022. And then, of course, as the pandemic ebbed, pandemic-related testing started to fall off, but normal healthcare wasn't resuming quite so quickly. So we had a tougher year in 2023, followed by a record year in 2024 as more normalized conditions have resumed, and we're seeing the benefit of all the different work and innovations through those period and capacity building. Similarly, we've been increasing our gross margins, both in dollar terms and percentage terms with different innovations. There have been a few plot twists through that, as you can imagine, and driving our EBITDA as well. And we're not exclusively focused on maximizing every dollar of bottom line profitability. What we're doing is reinvesting to drive the revenue value growth while driving enough EBITDA and net earnings to demonstrate that we're actually in control of the business and are building value in a controlled fashion. And you can see that a little bit with the improvements that we've instituted in both the debt to equity ratio of the company, which is now down to 0.35, and the current ratio of the company, which is now up over 7. So we're maintaining a very strong position of liquidity, recognizing market volatility up and down the line and a really weak state of small cap equity markets in Canada. We don't want to be hostage to the market and diluting shareholders. Again, we have an active normal course issuer bid or share repurchase plan. So we're in fact buying back more shares than even are being issued under our rolling stock option plan. So the rolling stock option plan issues about 2% in options each year as part of our overall compensation structure. And last year we bought back 3% of our shares outstanding. So we're in a net anti-dilutive position. And I see us becoming more aggressive with our share repurchases as we accelerate the profit growth and revenue growth of the company. So where are we? I mean, we're building the company. We want to very much get to revenues of over $100 million a year in the next few years. We'll do that by cross-selling between our many existing customers, securing new customers, generating new product classes, working in the burgeoning areas of molecular diagnostics, the PCR-based testing, and point-of-care testing, supporting multiplex testing, where you can test one sample for many disease conditions or pathogens, and working to support testing for antimicrobial resistance and viral variants, whether it's which high-risk HPV is a patient might be carrying, or an H5N1 flu, for example, making sure those kinds of tests work. And then our therapeutic Kinlytic project is really the supercharger on the already powerful engine that we've created. So our therapeutics program is accelerating the already rapid growth in earnings we're generating from our diagnostics related activities. So that's pretty much who we are, and where we built the company to, by design, is to become that go-to partner for next generation diagnostics, where we're enabling our customers to succeed even more, and succeeding alongside them by doing that, being that key partner and supplier to test makers and clinical labs. And that's where we see the benefits to our shareholders, substantiated by growth in revenues, growth in earnings, and share appreciation. So with that, maybe we've got a little time for questions. I don't want to burn all the time we have there, but hopefully that gives a bit of an introduction, and we try to be as good as we can on full, plain and true disclosure on what we're doing in a timely manner. And all of our news releases, I should say, are projects that have been completed. We typically don't announce things when we just conceive of an idea. We actually announce them when they've been executed, and you can see a lot of those are joint announcements with partners of ours.
With your projects, like the healthcare industry is heavily regulated, and drug companies and so forth. Do you have specific FDA testing or approvals to go through? Or since you're kind of selling your stuff to another company, it's up to them to get the approvals and to make sure their QC and processes and yours are in place? It's not the same level of hurdles that like a drug approval process
Not to the
suffer.
same levels as a drug, but it's pretty extensive. So for our ingredients business, those are classed as intermediate. So we have rigorous release profiles, but each lot is individually tested by our customer because it's an ingredient going into their products. For our caps, our test controls, those are fully regulated medical devices. And for those, we operate under an ISO standard called 13485, which is the medical devices manufacturing standard. And depending on what markets we're going to, there are different levels of clinical and other technical documentations that's required. So, for example, the European Union just massively upgraded its medical devices regulations from the in vitro diagnostic directives to the in vitro diagnostic regulations. So for insiders in the industry, that's going from IVDD to IVDR. And we just successfully completed that regulatory upgrade last fall. So our products are now able to be sold will continue to be able to be sold, and new products that we make will be able to be sold through Europe, even under those upgraded regulations. And we're compliant with Health Canada regulations, US FDA regulations, EU regulations, and Australian regulations, and we sell through distributors into countries that will accept any one of those different regulatory standards.
All right, but when you have a new test, it's not like a multi-year hurdle, like program to get it approved, like a drug would be.
Well, when we have a new test control, just making that distinction, normally we'll pilot it with different partners. We'll ensure its compatibility. If it's for a lab accreditation industry, they might test it with dozens of labs and make sure it works before they roll it out to thousands of labs. If it's for something we're making for a test maker, they'll run internal tests to supplement our own tests, and then it might be component of their clinical trial for an FDA registration for the test if it's going to be included in boxes of cartridges. So there's quite a bit, but not the same level of multiple years of testing that you go through with the drug. It's just a faster process, no less rigorous, but a lot quicker, thank God.
Yeah. Okay. Who are your competitors? Yeah, I don't hear. I'm not aware of this. It's a within a huge industry. It's still a big industry, but quite niche. Like, who are they? Other sort of small, medium-sized companies like yourselves, or divisions of the big guys, or what?
We fall into a broader category that you call life sciences tools companies. And there's a half a dozen, probably under a half a dozen companies that we compete with globally in each of the major segments in the test ingredients manufacturing and in the controls side of things. So it's a very it's a very specialty areas, good size opportunities in it, but fewer competitors. A lot of people say, "Gosh, I'm gonna come up and I'm gonna get a Chinese manufacturer to make a immunochromatography strip test." And there's, hundreds and hundreds of people making the strip test. There are, a half a dozen companies in the world that might be able to make a control for, different categories of tests, or even fewer than that, doing a multiplex control on a swab.
All right.
And what we've demonstrated is superlative quality, competitive price, and a hell of a lot of innovation. And that's why we're winning business and growing at a much more rapid clip. Our recurring revenue growth rate for 2024 over 2023 was over 40%. And I was at a major industry exposition talking with a competitor firm, and he said to me, we're having a great year. We're growing at 5%. We expect to grow at 5%. How are you doing? And I was, typical Canadian self-effacing approach. I'm going, well, we're doing a little bit better than that. It's we have our own challenges, and finally, the guy's pressing me, and I had to say, well, we're growing at on the order of 40% this year, and he just about fell off his chair. So we are doing quite well on this, and I don't want to be projecting 40% annual revenue growth and come in at 35 and get pilloried for it. So we are generally saying that we hope to keep things in the 20 to 40% annual growth band. Is what we're aiming to do, and in fact what we're achieving. And if we can beat the top end of that range, we sure as hell won't hold back, but it's not something we're going to be formally projecting.
How visible is your sales pipeline? Do you have good, and just to clarify, you have a September year end, so when you're talking 2024, that's to September year end, you've just closed off your fiscal Q1 25 at the end of December?
Exactly, and that'll be out mid-February.
Okay.
So I think Thursday is the 13th of February, so that's probably going to be our reporting date for Q1. So obviously, we know what our top line is. We're working through the accounting to drive bottom line. We do expect it to be up substantially from a recurring revenues point of view year over year, and we do expect it to be profitable.
How far out do you have visibilities? Like, do you get contracts for the year, or guidelines? A client will say, yeah, we're expecting to do 1 million QACs this year, and we'll give you monthly POs for it, or how much visibility do you have through the end of the year, let's say, or that?
Yeah, we've got good visibility. I'll grab something for fun.
All right.
We go through a pretty rigorous process. That's the board binder for our 2024 fiscal budget planning session, and there's the one for our fiscal 2023, and I could go further back, but we go through product by product, customer by customer, quarter by quarter revenue expectations. We have good longitudinal visibility on our ingredients business, because that's customers planning, and there's a long manufacturing cycle for these products. So you can't just show up and say, I want, uh,
Yeah.
you know, 3 grams of highly purified virus, that can be a 4-month production cycle. So there's good visibility on that.
Yeah.
The quality control side has a shorter manufacturing cycle. But then the customers there, they've got to plan their own, we're constituents to their kits. So
Yeah.
for them to be making customer deliveries and orders and or product development, there's good projection there. So it's pretty good. It's not perfect, but we've got reasonable visibility.
It sounds like for at least like the next next 3 months has to be pretty clear, and the coming 6 months seems to have you got pretty solid visibility, I would think on that.
Yeah, we've got good visibility. Obviously, we have to have it for the current quarter because it's
Yeah.
things already have to be being manufactured, and then you've just got to be mindful of quarter end that something falls on the first rather than the 31st for ship dates. So you can't mess
Yeah.
around with revenue recognition around a quarter end. And so that's where you can fall off if something just misses the cutoff date.
Yeah. But in terms of
And
production
then
planning and everything, okay, it falls into Q2 or Q3, fine, but you know what roughly each season is going to
absolutely,
look
and
like.
yeah, and I'd say we've got, very good clarity in a current quarter, good clarity 6 months out, and then, it's more customer related variability for, months 6 through 12. If anything changes from a client perspective, that's when we can get bitten if something changes with one of our customers. But
All right.
our own planning, obviously, because we're a manufacturer, sales and marketing has to generate well-reasoned projections that the executive management, the board accept, and then production has to make sure they've got resources to actually make that amount of product, and QC and QA to have resources to test it and release it similarly. And we've got a fantastic R&D group as well for doing bespoke product development. And now we're starting to be able to afford to do um, some more of our own strategic product growth as well, that are things that are not necessarily explicitly ordered by customers, but are rather opportunities we want to develop and explore on our own.
You're generating cash, which you're paying down your debt and you're buying back shares. Are acquisitions a potential direction with that excess cash to go down that pathway?
Potentially, yes. We haven't had, our stock price as currency, our shares as currency hasn't been at a level that's really been encouraging us to do acquisitions. We did look at a couple in 2023, but they were more additive than strategically imperative. So, we elected not to pull the trigger on any of those. And one of the main reasons was we were in the middle of upgrading our ERP systems, and we don't discount the complexities of integrating an acquisition as well. So it felt
Yeah.
like it was going to be a bit cruel and unusual punishment for our team to try and integrate an acquisition in the middle of an ERP system changeover.
Yeah.
So, but your question's very astute. As we're accumulating cash, the uh, there's going to be an increasing pressure to, either find and execute accretive acquisitions, buy back shares more aggressively, or institute a dividend. So those are kind of your three options there at that point, and I think we'll have to look at all of them.
Well, we covered a lot of area here. That's great. We should wrap it up. Can you tie a bow on it? Any final comments or thoughts for viewers at the end of this?
Yeah, I think for investors, in Canadian small cap, I mean, finding companies that you can have justifiable confidence in, that they're on a growth trajectory, that there's financial stability, and I'd represent dedicated and responsible management with a bench to make that happen. We're a pretty, I wouldn't say we're a unicorn, but we're a rare breed in any respect that we can deliver, high rate of return over multiple years, and that you can have confidence that this is actually an investable company and not just a speculation. And management and directors own a whack of stock, so we're also putting our money where our mouth is.
Well, how much roughly does the insiders own of the share?
We insiders and founders, we own about say about 15% of the company, 15 to yeah, about 15% of the company is owned internally. There's good disclosure in our management information circular on board ownership, and all our senior managers own stock as well. So we're in it for the right reasons for shareholders.
All right, good skin in the game. Cameron, thank
Yeah.
you. Appreciate it.
Thanks,
That's
Martin. This
great.
has
Love
been
to get an
fun.
update as things
Absolutely.
progress. There's a lot of fun catching up, and talk to you soon, and have a great day.
Thank you. And keep your eyes out for our Q1 in mid-February.
You got it. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.
All right. Thanks. Bye.